Hi guys, I'm here today to teach you a little bit about sewing. So I know that some people can find it quite daunting when they first think about picking up a sewing machine, and I'm here today to show you that it's not as scary as it seems, and we're going to run over a bit of troubleshooting. So if you encounter any problems, hopefully this will help you out a bit. Okay, so we're going to be looking at two different types of fabric today. So this should cover all your cosplay needs. So if we're talking about making, say, a princess dress, where we want a tight-fitted bodice, for example, the best sort of fabric to use for that would be a non-stretch fabric, like so. This is just a heavyweight cotton. Now, the main thing that I would talk about with this is just be careful when you are cutting out your pattern pieces that you keep to the straight of grain. And this is something that I messed up my very first cosplay doing. So this fabric has a vertical and horizontal weave, which means that when it's stretched either vertically or horizontally, it does not stretch. Now, something to be aware of with this, when you are cutting out your pattern pieces, make sure to keep that straight of grain the same with each pattern piece. Otherwise, what you might get is if it's stretched diagonally on the bias, it stretches a lot more. Now, you can work this to your advantage. However, if you were to sew a piece on the straight of grain to a piece on the bias, it will warp on the body and it would not provide the best fit for your costume. And the next type of fabric that we're looking at is stretch fabric. So this would be really ideal if you're making like a superhero suit. So it stretches. This is a four-way stretch. So it stretches horizontally and vertically. So you can make very tight-fitting costumes with this. So there are a couple of differences when sewing stretch and non-stretch that you might want to be aware of, and we're about to get into that right now. It's always a good habit to have a scrap bit of fabric, the same type of fabric that you're working on at hand, so that when you start to stitch, you can test on this fabric first, and if anything goes wrong, it's not going to mess up your pre-cut patterns. So for non-stretch fabrics, you should use a universal needle between the sizes of 70 to 90. It's normally the average. For stretch fabric, it's best to use a stretch needle. The differences between universal and stretch needles are universal needles have a sharp blade, so they pierce the fabric, whereas the stretch needles are blunt on the tip, so they slide past the fabric as opposed to piercing it, and this basically stops it from skipping any stitches. We're going to start with a straight stitch on the non-stretch fabric. So I have my two pieces of fabric all pinned together. This would be your seam allowance, and I have my line drawn out just so that I have a guide. And here's our straight stitch sewn into the fabric. As you can see, it's really strong and durable. Okay, so I'm now moving on to the stretch fabric. I've got my stretch needle set up in the machine here, and I'm going to do a zigzag stitch. The reason why you'll do a zigzag stitch instead of a straight stitch is that a straight stitch does not stretch, whereas a zigzag will stretch with the fabric and it won't tear. Here we have our stretch fabric sewn in with our zigzag stitch, and as you can see, the fabric stretches perfectly, the thread's not breaking, and it has a lot of movement in there. So this is what can happen if you sew it with a universal needle instead of a stretch needle. You can skip stitches. This wouldn't be a major issue, but it could be something to look out for. It could affect the wearing of your garment. So we've started stitching our fabric, but something goes wrong. What do we do? Well, I'll show you some troubleshooting issues right now, and we can hopefully try and sort that out. Okay, so we're looking at the tension. So the top side of the fabric, the stitches might look all right, but as we look on the underneath side of the fabric, we can see that the tension on this side is far too loose. And on this side, the tension is too tight. So if you were to wear this costume, your threads could snap while wearing it. And here's some issues you might run into if your tension is not correct on stretch fabric. So here you can see there are some skip stitches and the thread is starting to tangle. And if you'd like to learn anything else about sewing, such as how to thread a machine, come and see us at Cosplay Lab at CosXPo.